until this Friday, 11:59 Eastern Standard Time in the evening. So that's right before midnight. And again, if you have questions about this material, feel free to unmute yourself or place it into the chat. So today we're going to talk about respiratory physiology. Now, one thing to note is there have been some systems we have not addressed. For example, we haven't really addressed directly the kidneys, reproductive system, digestive tract. Digestive tract you'll get in semester 3 with nutrition. And you get more of the anatomy physiology there. Reproductive physiology, we don't really address in this program as much. So if you go into nursing or some other health field, you'll find you'll need those anatomy courses. But we will deal with respiratory physiology. Why? Because it's interesting and it's in the course outline in the syllabus. And just as a note, when I was in grad school, my master's advisor had his PhD in respiratory physiology. So it's neat when you have someone, it's their passion to teach it. And so respiratory physiology is a little bit my passion also, just because I find it interesting. Well, let's start with announcements. First off, if you are in the area, the Georgian College Fitness Center is now open. You can exercise from 3 p.m. to 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Of course, you must currently be enrolled in courses at Georgian College, which you are if you're here, unless you hacked into the system. You need to present your one card, and you must book a time to use the facility. They can only take 25 people at a time. There's more details on the web link that we posted in the Blackboard announcements a few weeks ago. As a side note, I just had a meeting with an instructor who's teaching second semester courses, and he was doing a practical exam. So the students don't have their practical exam yet. It's next week and the week after, but he was letting them practice. And he said the performance for some was really good, but for others was abysmal in the sense of, I'll give you an example. He asked the student, because the students were in pairs and they had an odd number, he said to one student, okay, you'll train me. And he said to the student, okay, set it up for this exercise. And he said that it took the student 6 minutes to adjust the height of the weight where it sat on the rest, on the catch, and to put the weights on. And then when the student went to demonstrate, they hadn't set it up properly, so it was really awkward. And he said it was obvious as night and day that this student never exercises. So if you start regularly exercising, then these evaluations you have in second semester will be that much easier. Imagine again, if you're a chef and you come to school and you learn how to make all these wonderful dishes, and then you go home and you order pizza, or you have ramen noodles, and that's all you ever do. The culinary instructors notice that, and the fitness instructors notice if you exercise. So if you're in the Barrie area, then feel free to join the fitness facility. We got a question about when is the semester finished. The semester is finished on Friday, December 17th. That's the last day of the semester, and our exam, your final exam, is December 14th, and we'll do a review next week on that. Okay. Again, if you're on campus, we have a Georgian dining room, so we are unique. We're the only fitness program in all of the Ontario colleges. There's 14 fitness programs across the province. We're the only one in a hospitality department. And what does that mean? It means I work with chefs who are great, because why? You get food. And one of those perks is this is right now available only to students and staff at the college, but the Georgian dining room, it is in the E building, room 100. If you've been on campus, you may have passed by it actually. It's open for lunch from Monday to Friday. And it's open for dinner on Wednesdays. Now, you can't just show up anytime. What you need to do is make a reservation. And then if you're coming in for lunch, you need to be there at 12 o'clock. Students in the past have gotten this wrong, where they show up at 1 o'clock and say, oh, it's too late. And they're like, no, everybody has to be here at 12 o'clock. If you're showing up for dinner, you need to be there at 6 o'clock. And for under $10 Canadian, you can get a 3-course meal. They always have vegan options and vegetarian options. And also they have beverages. So you can get a soda pop or chai or coffee, whatever the case may be. Bun on the Run this semester is open from on Wednesdays and Thursdays, and this is more food to go. So you can drop in, pay for your food, you get it in a container, and you can take it and have it somewhere else on the campus. And again, these are culinary and hospitality students who are preparing this food and helping to serve you. Next quiz is available this Friday at 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and it's available until 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on Friday, December 17th. Usual format, 20 questions, multiple choice, maybe true and false, 30 minutes to complete. unlimited attempts. I'm still going into Blackboard and noticing that some students have not done many of the quizzes. This is a relatively the most straightforward way to get 10% on your final grades. It can make the difference, right? You think about it, 10% in your grades could take you from a C to a B, which would be 60 something to 70 something, or from a B to an A, which is 70 something to 80 something percent. So I would, of course, encourage you to complete the quizzes and make as many attempts. Keep trying them until you get 80% on each of them. And finally, where are we in the semester? We're in week 12, November 29th to December 3rd. Today, where I am, is November 30th. So we will be talking about respiratory physiology. So we're going to dive right in. Somebody's just asked, when does your next semester start? The first day of your next semester is January 10th, Monday, January 10th. You will have on-campus practical components. Regardless of what happens with COVID, we are a practical-based program, and we have had practical-based classes run on semesters all during COVID. The only exception was at the end of the winter 2020 semester when COVID first hit. So this information is found on chapter 22, pages 819 to 857. And as with cardiovascular physiology, we will talk a bit about the anatomy of it, but then we'll quickly go into the theory behind it and the physiology behind it to give you an idea of what's going on with the respiratory system. And when we talk about respiratory system, we're talking about gas exchange. So even the most of the general population realize that we breathe in, we breathe out, and when we breathe in, we take oxygen into the system. When we breathe out carbon dioxide. And it's this gas exchange that is the purpose of the respiratory system. And if you think back to week 3 with metabolism of the cell, that's where we talked about, well, how is oxygen being used? How is carbon dioxide being produced? Well, oxygen is being used in the electron transport chain, carbon dioxide and water vapor are being produced in the electron transport chain, and a bit in in the Krebs cycle. So basic anatomy. Okay, and we're going to start with the annotation a bit. Make sure we have an appropriate color. So really your oxygen supply, oh, that should be O2. You think after a semester I learned how to type. And this is basically for cellular respiration. And then your carbon dioxide disposal is a waste product. Okay, and the respiratory and the circulatory systems are closely coupled. So what does that mean? We breathe in the air, the oxygen will go from our lungs into the bloodstream, which is the circulatory system, and the blood will take that oxygen to the cells, we'll pick up carbon dioxide, drop off the oxygen, come back, and we breathe out. Also, you're going to have olfaction, which is basically smelling, which is a useful tool because then we can detect danger, or we can detect food or sources of food, and smelling really is involved a lot with taste also. And then also is involved with speech. Okay, so respiration has 4 processes. First off, there's pulmonary ventilation. Okay, so this is just breathing in and out. Second, we have external respiration. External respiration is oxygen and carbon dioxide being transferred between your lungs and your blood. So oxygen goes from your lungs to your blood, carbon dioxide goes from your blood to your lungs. Oh, sorry, should have put a number 3. You have transportation of carbon dioxide and oxygen in your blood. And then you have internal respiration. So with external respiration, That's oxygen going from the lungs to the blood, carbon dioxide going from the blood to the lungs. Internal respiration is oxygen going from the blood to the tissues, and the carbon dioxide going from the tissues to the blood. So 4 processes: pulmonary ventilation, external respiration, transport, and internal respiration. So the trachea is basically also known as your windpipe. And you can feel this on the front of your throat. If you gently rub your fingers down, you can feel that there are ridges on it. And this covers your larynx to your medius sternum, which is basically midpoint of your sternum, of your breastbone. Okay. It then divides into 2 branches, which are called bronchi. Sorry, should put that below. Bronchi. And it is about 10 centimeters long, 2 centimeters diameter, and very flexible. And it needs to be flexible. Why? So that we can flex and extend and laterally flex our neck so that I can move with it. The wall is composed of 3 layers. You have the mucosa, and in here you can see the mucosa is the innermost layer of the lumen, and the lumen being the hole in the middle of the trachea, right? And what does it have? Well, it has ciliated pseudo, yep, stratified epithelium with goblet cells. And if you recall back, a cilium are these extensions of the cell that basically wave back and forth, but they do kind of a dance. They start upright and then they bend down and then roll back up. And the reason being is they're pushing mucus past, and then they roll back up and they push the mucus past. And what happens in general, we have debris which is caught in the mucus, and the cilia push that mucus up until you either cough it out or you swallow it. Second, submucosa. So this is connective tissue with seromucous glands supported by 16 to 20 C-shaped cartilage rings that prevent collapse. And so these trachea, so imagine if it wasn't for these cartilage rings, the trachea could collapse, and that's not good, especially when you're sleeping, because if it collapses, you're not going to get air going in and out of your lungs. You're not going to have that external and internal respiration. And you know, if you've ever worked with any kind of hoses or tubes, the closest comparison you may see to this would be a vacuum hose, because a vacuum hose is not just smooth most of the time. Most of the time it has these undulations on the side which add strength to it so it doesn't collapse, or hoses on a pool. So in North America, at least, people will pay for a pool at their house. It could be above ground, it could be a below in-ground pool, but you see it really better with the above ground pools, because you'll have a hose going from this basically skimmer, like it's a hole in the side of the wall where the water goes in, it gets sucked in and goes through a filter. And that hose from the hole to the filter will usually have wire rings in it or a wire spiral in it to keep it from collapsing, because the suction on that can be quite powerful for what it is. And then third, adventitia. So this is the outermost layer made of connective tissue. And this is basically, we can see here, the adventitia right here is just connective tissue that is protecting it. It's like that external covering. Now, there's going to be some other parts of this. Trachealis, which is smooth muscle fibers that connect posterior parts of cartilage rings, and this contracts during coughing to expel mucus. The idea is we do not want to have that mucus going into the lungs necessarily, because it could cause problems such as pneumonia or bacterial infections. And a specialized part of the cartilage rings is called the carina. And this is the last tracheal cartilage that is expanded and found at the point where the trachea branches into two main bronchi. And the mucosa of the carina is very highly sensitive, where you will have violent coughing if any foreign object makes contact with it. So if anything gets all the way down to that carina, you're going to be coughing up. It's like a protective mechanism to keep anything foreign out of your trachea. I mean, and so the interesting thing is, right now we're in a COVID global pandemic. Now we have the Omicron variant or Omicron variant of it. And we hear stories about people where the reaction to COVID is so adverse that they need to be put on an artificial respirator, like a mechanical respirator. And to do that, they need to stick a tube down into the lungs, which can irritate the carina. So to prevent that coughing, they need to put you in a medically induced coma. So basically you're asleep so that you don't have any of these adverse reactions. It's very uncomfortable to have that breathing tube put down your trachea. So this is where we go to the thing about, let's say, smoking, and we could talk about tobacco and non-tobacco cigarette smoking, right? And regular smoking inhibits and ultimately destroys cilia. If you have no ciliary activity, this equals coughing as the only way to prevent mucus right. So you're going to be smoking, and smoking will destroy or inhibit those cilia, those little extensions of the cell which sweep the mucus up. So really smoking is the only way to get any foreign objects out. So if you have a smoker with a respiratory congestion, then avoid medications which inhibit the cough reflex. Okay, so that's the one thing about smoking, and so just so we're aware of the research, we have decades and decades of research that shows that there is a strong relationship between cigarette smoking or tobacco smoking and heart disease and cancer and lung disease. And of course, you know, ultimately you get the comment from some students who are like, oh, well, I had an uncle and they smoked a cigarette until they're 90, like they smoked a pack a day of cigarettes until they're 96 years old, and then when they passed away is because this runaway bull ran them over and killed them. Yeah, that's the exception to the rule. If we were to take 50,000 people who don't smoke and 50,000 people who do smoke, we find in general the incidence of heart disease, cancer, and lung disease is lower in those who don't smoke than those who do. Now, we would be remiss if we did not talk about vaping. While this can also have detrimental effects on the respiratory system. So students would say, well, what's the big deal about vaping? Because it's just heated water vapor. Yeah, it's heated water vapor, but there's also a lot of different chemicals in there. And we do know that there is an association between vaping and what they call popcorn lungs, which is basically the lungs lose their elasticity, and those tiny little air sacs in the lungs called alveoli eventually merge into each other, which means you have lower surface area for gas exchange, which means you may have issues getting enough oxygen into your system. So neither way is good. And you can try and tell me, oh, it's not so bad. No, it's bad. Another kind of clinical aspect of it is the Heimlich maneuver. So this is something that you should be aware of. If there is an obstruction within the windpipe, within the trachea, that can be life-threatening, because if you cannot have the air exchange occurring, eventually the person will pass out, their heart will stop, and then they'll die. So the Heimlich maneuver is basically you lean the person, you're standing behind the person, so the person in front is choking, you're the person behind, you make a fist with one hand, and you put your hand around the person and grab the top of your fist with the other hand, and you pull sharp up, in and up. And the idea is you're increasing the pressure within the lungs, which will hopefully cause that obstruction to pop out. It's like you're literally making the person into an air gun, because you're pulling hard and fast, hopefully increasing enough pressure within the lungs for that person to spit out whatever object it is. Keeping in mind that you're usually pulling so hard and fast that you're going to break some bones. You're going to break some ribs. So you do need to have them go to the hospital afterwards. If you're dealing with an infant that you can hold in your hands, then basically you would place them stomach down across your forearm and then give 5 thumps with the heel of your hand. Same idea, creating enough air pressure within the lungs to spit out whatever they have. If you're by yourself and you start to choke, then you can find a hard, flat object, such as the back of a chair or maybe a textbook or a clipboard, and thrust it in yourself to try and get it out. The general rule with people who choke in public places is they start to feel embarrassed and they will try to isolate. So if you see someone making the universal sign or looking very uncomfortable, like they're choking, and they start to go to the bathroom, you should probably follow them, because there are cases where there's a dinner party at a restaurant, and somebody goes, hey, where's Frank or where's Sally? And they go look, and there they are, dead in the bathroom, because no one went with them and they were ashamed. So don't be ashamed. Choking happens. Okay, so this is where we start to get into the physiology of it, and we're going to do a really, really, really rough drawing of it. But you have your trachea, which breaks down into bronchi, and then you have your lungs. Okay, so there's your lungs, very poorly drawn, I'm sorry. But if we were to zoom in on this area, what we would see is that this bronchi then breaks down further and it branches and branches and branches until you get to the end where you get these alveolar sacs. And these alveolar sacs, if we were to further magnify them, would be here, where you can see the side profile of one of them. And if we were to further magnify, you can see that the blood vessels are going right by the alveoli sacs. And then this is a scan, electron scan of the capillary system within the alveoli. So really, we're talking about respiratory zone structures. Okay, so there's a conducting zone and a respiratory zone. The conducting zone you can think of as the trachea, the bronchioles, right? They conduct the air to the respiratory zone where the gas exchange occurs. So the respiratory zone begins where terminal bronchioles feed into respiratory bronchioles. Okay, and these lead to alveolar sacs. Oh, sorry, lead to alveolar ducts, which then lead into alveolar sacs, and the alveolar sacs contain clusters of alveoli, and we have about 300 million alveoli that make up most of the lung volume. And the alveoli are the sites of gas exchange. So these tiny air sacs that you're looking at really in this diagram right here, that is where the actual gas exchange happens, where you get oxygen from the air that's been breathed in to go into the bloodstream and carbon dioxide in the blood to go into the alveoli. The respiratory membranes is basically a blood-air barrier. So you have these membranes, which is like a barrier between the blood and the air. It consists of alveolar and capillary walls, capillaries being the small blood vessels, and fused basement membranes. They're very thin in terms of about, depending on the source, 0.5 micrometers. And the gas exchange is by simple diffusion. So it's fairly straightforward. The gas is just going in between the two. So we're going to clear that out. And we'll change the color so we can distinguish what we put up here. The alveolar walls consist of, first off, a single layer of squamous epithelium. So these are type 1 alveolar cells. And they're also scattered cuboidal type 2 alveolar cells that secrete surfactant and antimicrobial proteins. So these cells will actually be secreting surfactant, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And these antimicrobial proteins, because really your lungs are exposed to the external environment. So when if you're standing next to someone and they're coughing and you're breathing in whatever they're coughing out. So if they're breathing out viruses or bacteria that are not good for you, you're breathing those in, and they can and will travel into your lungs. So you need to make sure that you have these proteins which will help to kill those off. Other features. First off, these alveoli, are surrounded by fine elastic fibers and pulmonary capillaries. So, and what we mean by that is typically if someone was to say, well, here's the alveoli, then other people would say, oh, well, here's the capillary goes past. But in actuality, you have a number of capillaries going past the alveoli. And to describe it, it's literally like you have a sheet of blood going past the alveoli. So that, as you can see in here, you may have a space for alveoli here, space for alveoli here, space for alveoli here, just surrounded and surrounded and surrounded by those blood vessels. Two, you have these alveolar pores, okay, which connect adjacent alveoli, and why they will equalize air pressure and provide alternative routes in case of blockage. And also these alveolar pores, so I don't know if you can really see it, but you have these little macrophages. These are immune cells within the alveoli, and they can actually go through those alveolar pores to travel from one alveoli to another alveoli. And third, you have these alveolar macrophages, which keep the alveolar surface sterile, because even though it's inside your body, your lungs are exposed to the outside environment. So these macrophages will go roaming about, and if they find some foreign debris or an invader such as bacteria or virus, they will try to destroy them. Just give you an idea, 2 million dead macrophages per, what unit of time do you think? So you got 2 million dead macrophages per week, per month, per day. How about per hour are carried by cilia to the throat and swallowed. So there you go. If you're ever like, I'm not so hungry and I don't know why, maybe you've just had an abnormally high number of macrophages that you've been consuming that hour. I mean, they are primarily protein. So the blood supply of the lung. You're going to have two blood supplies. First off, pulmonary circulation. And this is to deliver systemic venous blood from the heart to the lungs for oxygenation, which means we're going to pick up oxygen. The second type that most people don't think of is bronchial circulation. And this is to provide oxygenated blood from, to the lung tissue. Because the lung is an organ, it requires its own oxygen supply. But having said this, there are lung transplants which have and will be and have been conducted where they, let's say you have cystic fibrosis or you have some type of lung disease, maybe it was a tumorous cancer, they need to remove your lungs and put in donor lungs. They cannot hook up the bronchial circulation, but just from the fact that the lungs are so well exposed to oxygen means that you don't necessarily have to have the bronchial circulation. Okay, so that's basically going into the anatomy, right, of it. Now we're starting to get into basically the mechanics and the physiology behind pulmonary physiology. So there are factors which will affect basically the pulmonary ventilation, which means this will affect how well the air goes in and out of the lungs and what happens with it. So here, I'm going to throw in this picture. So there's 3 factors which influence the ease of air passage and the amount of energy required for ventilation. First off, airway resistance. Okay, so friction is a major non-elastic source of resistance to gas flow. And this occurs in the airways. So relationship between friction pressure and resistance is as follows. Gas flow changes inversely with resistance. So what does that mean? Gas flow changes inversely with resistance. If you increase resistance, gas flow goes down. If you decrease resistance, gas flow goes up. That's what it means by inversely related with each other. Resistance in respiratory, we call it a tree, is usually insignificant for 2 reasons. First off, diameters of airways in first part of conducting zone are huge. So if you have a bigger airway, the resistance goes down disproportionately, like exponentially. It's not a linear decrease. If you increase the airway by how much the resistance goes down. Second, progressive branching. Branching of airways as they get smaller, leads to increase in total cross sectional area. So in this diagram, we can see that the resistance increases as we start branching out until we get to the medium-sized bronchi. And then because you have so many branches after that, the resistance just drops off down almost to nothing. So any resistance is usually the highest in the medium-sized bronchi, and then after that, it drops down. Second factor, alveolar tension, surface tension. So what is surface tension? Surface tension is the attraction of liquid molecules to one another at a gas liquid interface. And so it's not the best example, but if you took a clear bottle of water, this is not a clear bottle of water, a clear glass of water, and you look at the edge where the water meets the top of the water meets the container, you see the top of the water doesn't go flat, but actually as it approaches the bottle or the glass goes up a bit, and that's from the surface tension. And you think back to week number 2 or week number 1, we talked about water. Water is simple, but it's complex. It's bent, it's polarized, and it's sticky. Water sticks to each other, and that's partially what we mean by surface tension. So this means that it tends to draw liquid molecules. Oh, sorry. Tends to draw liquid molecules. Where are we? Closer together. And reduce contact with dissimilar gas molecules. Resist any force that tends to increase surface area of liquid. And water, which has a very high surface tension, coats alveolar walls in a thin film. And this tends to cause alveoli to shrink to smallest size. That is, it will cause the alveoli to collapse. What you don't want the alveoli to collapse. So you think of the inside of the alveoli and it's coated in water, and because the water molecules attract each other, it's going to cause the alveoli to collapse, but that's not what you want. So how do we prevent that? Well, you may have heard this before. We have surfactant. And surfactant is a detergent like lipid and protein complex that helps reduce surface tension of alveolar fluid. So airway resistance is going to be one thing, which affects the ease at which air passage and the amount of energy required for ventilation. Alveolar surface tension is the second factor. And then for the third, we have lung compliance. So lung compliance is a measure of change in lung volume that occurs with given change in transpulmonary pressure. It's basically how elastic, how much stretch do you have? This is normally high, but can be decreased due to, oh, sorry, normally high, actually, hang on. Sorry about that, is normally high because of distensibility of the lung, right? And also because of surfactant, which decreases alveolar tension. And basically, if you have higher compliance, it means the lungs stretch easier. So then we get into different measurements of lung, basically assessing ventilation. So the orientation to this chart, we're actually looking at two charts. So on the top, we have basically just showing the different zones. On the bottom, we have the definition of what these zones are, and they're color coordinated. So just your normal breathing, which we see here in the middle, is called your tidal volume. So tidal volume is basically how much you breathe in and out just normally. Like you're just, for example, you're just sitting there, you're breathing in and out normally. Normally it's around 500 milliliters for each males and females. So per breath, you're breathing in and out about half a liter of air. Now this depends, of course, on body volume, body size, but that's a reasonable average. Now, if you were to breathe out normally and then breathe in as much as you could, that would be your inspiratory capacity, okay? So your inspiratory capacity is the maximum amount of air that can breathe in after a normal tidal volume expression or expiration. So it's at the end of expiration that you breathe in as much as you can. And how much is that? That's your inspiratory capacity. Now, if you were to breathe out as much as you can, right, from that very top to the very bottom, so you breathe in as much as you can, then breathe out as much as you can. That's called your vital capacity. And that can be anywhere from 4.5 to 6 liters. It could be as low as 2.5 or 3 liters, depending on the person. The difference between your tidal volume and how much you can breathe out is going to be your expiratory reserve volume. The difference between the top of your tidal volume and how much you can breathe in is your inspiratory volume. The difference between the bottom of the tidal volume and the top of how much you can breathe in is your inspiratory capacity. The difference between the bottom of how much you normally breathe in and getting rid of all the air in your lungs is your functional residual capacity. And then your total lung capacity is how much you can breathe from all the way in to all the way out, plus some. So it's good to note that this green region here, the residual volume, you always have in your lungs. The only way we can get rid of this is if we were literally put you in a vacuum. So for example, put you into space and there's no air and all the air within your lungs gets sucked out. Not fun. Okay, so at that point, or at this point, let's resume the recording. So when it comes to assessing ventilation, and welcome back everybody, you will need to know approximately what the values are. So tidal volume being about 500 milliliters and total lung capacity being approximately 6,000 milliliters or 6 liters, give or take. Vital capacity is what we call from the maximum amount of air you can breathe in to the maximum amount of air you can blow out, which is about 4,800 milliliters also. So you should be familiar with those values, which are available in your textbook. So when we come to basically breathing, there is going to be an amount of what we call dead space. This basically means it doesn't contribute to gas exchange. Just make sure we have an appropriate color. So anatomical dead space means a space that does not contribute to gas exchange. Okay, and it's basically air that remains in the passage ways. So you breathe in and you breathe out, but there's kind of like that air in the middle, which may be the anatomical dead space. It doesn't get pushed out. It doesn't get pushed into the respiratory or to the respiratory zone. So it's basically not contributing. And there's specifically also alveolar dead space. And this is space occupied by non-functional alveoli. And for whatever reason, it could be that they are basically collapsed or obstructed. It means there's a block in the way and the air can't get to them, or the alveoli have actually collapsed. And total dead space is basically the sum or the addition of the anatomical and alveolar dead space. And that's basically it. So you will get space in your lungs, which will not contribute to gas exchange. So there are going to be times where you are going to need to assess ventilation. And now the only thing to note is there is one mistake on this image. This person should be having a nose plug over her nose. So why don't we, let's see, what color should we make it? Let's give her a dark purple nose plug. So this nose plug prevents any air getting in or out of her nose. And a pulmonary function test is when we measure the rate of gas movement. So basically, we want to measure how fast the air can get out of the pulmonary system, out of the lungs. And one of these is a forced vital capacity, which is also known as FVC. And this is the amount of gas forcibly expelled after taking a deep breath. So the person that we're measuring would maybe breathe in and out a few times, kind of like prime the system, get the elasticity of the lungs going, and then they take as deep a breath in as they can. They'd fill up their lungs as much as possible. They would plug their nose, put this device in their mouth, and blow as hard and as fast as long as they could. And this device, this is an analog device. You can see it has a little needle on it. Usually we use now digital devices. It would measure how much air is getting blown out in that time. Now, there's also called a respiratory volume, right? FEV. And this is the amount of gas expelled during a specific time interval of FVC. And normally it would be an FEV1, which is the amount of air expelled in first second. So in the first second of blowing out, how much air gets out? And a healthy individual can expel 80% of their forced vital capacity in the first second. So we're not pulmonary physiologists, we're not respiratory therapists, but this is an assessment that you could potentially use, especially if you become a kinesiologist or a physical therapist or occupational therapist. And we would not be, it would not be within our scope of practice to diagnose, but we could recognize there's an issue and then send them to a referral for a specific diagnosis. So if we do a FEV and within the first second only 60% of the air comes out, we would refer that individual to a specialist for further investigation. So gas exchange, as a reminder, external respiration is diffusion of gases between the lungs and blood. Internal respiration, diffusion of gases between the blood and tissues, right? So at the tissue level, that's internal respiration. both of these are subject to 1, basic properties of gases, and 2, composition of the alveolar gas. So how well external and internal respiration occur depends on basically what are the nature of the gases that you're breathing in and out, and what is the composition of those gases within your alveoli. So if we're going to move on, so what we're seeing here, and we're going to see if we can move this over here so it's out of the way. What we're seeing here is we see different types of gases on the left-hand side. So at the top we have nitrogen, then oxygen, then carbon dioxide, and then water vapor. And this is all basic. In the atmosphere, and we refer to at sea level because at sea level, that's where generally the air is the densest. As you go up in elevation, the air thins. You know, so you imagine you're at the top of Mount Everest, the air is very thin. You're at sea level, relatively speaking, the air is very dense. And if you're at the Dead Sea, which is below sea level, the air is even a little bit more dense. But of the gases within the air, approximately 78% of the gas in the air is made up of nitrogen. Approximately 21% is oxygen, 0.04% is carbon dioxide, and 0.46% is water vapor, and that adds up to 100. Now, if we were to measure the pressure of the air at sea level is 760 millimeters of mercury. So 78.6% of 760 is 597. So 597 millimeters of mercury pressure is contributed to by nitrogen, 159 by oxygen, 0.3 millimeters of mercury by carbon dioxide, and 3.7 millimeters of mercury by water vapor. Now things change a bit as we go into the alveoli within the lungs. Nitrogen decreases a bit to 74.9%. Oxygen decreases a bit, 13.7%. Carbon dioxide goes up to 5.2. Water vapor goes up to 6.2. And then we see the relative pressures that these gases make up, which basically brings us to Dalton's law of partial pressure. Dalton's law basically says the total pressure exerted by a mixture of gas is equal to the sum of pressures exerted by each gas. So that total of 760 millimeters of mercury will be the answer if you were to add up the individual pressures of all of those gases. And you can see this in the sense of this very simple diagram. On the bottom right-hand side, if we take this pink looking gas that is in a tank at a pressure of 2 atmospheres, so that's 2 times the atmospheric pressure, and we add it to this purple looking gas, which is at an atmospheric pressure of 4 atmospheres, that's 4 times the pressure of the atmosphere. If we were to take both those gases and put them in one tank of the same size, well, 2 plus 4 equals 6. So the total pressure within the gas would be 6 atmospheres. That's how it works also with the basic gases of our environment. You take the total pressure of nitrogen, total pressure of oxygen, total pressure of carbon dioxide, total pressure of water, and then you have like these trace gases, you'll come up with 100% or 760 millimeters of mercury at sea level. And we'll move this back here. So Henry's law, basically, with this law, as pressure decreases, a gas's ability to dissolve decreases also. So the example of this is, you take a bottle of soda pop, carbonated beverage, and we know that there's carbon dioxide dissolved within that liquid. But we don't see the carbon dioxide coming out, right? In the sense of this cap is closed, it's created a closed system. So basically the pressure within the air at the neck of the bottle is such that it's keeping any dissolved carbon dioxide within the liquid. Once we open that cap, what do we hear? Psst. Now that this pressure has decreased, the carbon dioxide's ability to be dissolved in that liquid has decreased, and we see the bubbles rising to the surface. And this is how you get a carbonated beverage. That's why once you open up that bottle or that can of carbonated beverage, eventually it will go what we call flat because the carbon dioxide has come out. So with Henry's law, it's basically if we have a system of lower pressure, we will have lower gas dissolved. And if we have a system of higher pressure, we will have more gas dissolved in the liquid, that is. And you can see this represented by the yellow dots. The yellow dots represents the gas that we're worried about, and so that's represented. So basically each gas dissolves in liquid in proportion to its partial pressure. So if you have more of this gas in the atmosphere, you'll get more dissolved in the liquid. And at equilibrium, the partial pressures in the two phases will be equal, right? So the amount of gas that's dissolved will be proportionate to the amount of gas that is in that atmosphere. The amount of gas that will dissolve depends on, first off, solubility. Okay, so how well can it dissolve within the liquid? The carbon dioxide is very soluble in water. In fact, it's more soluble than oxygen, whereas nitrogen is not very soluble in water at all. The other factor is temperature. So as temperature increases, the solubility increases. So these alveoli contain more carbon dioxide and water vapor than in the air. So the mixing of the alveolar gas with each breath, you get this external respiration, involves the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide across this membrane. And the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide in the lungs is influenced by, first off, partial pressure gradients and gas solubilities. Second, thickness and surface area of respiratory membrane. And the third, ventilation, perfusion, coupling. Okay, so what does this all mean? The partial pressure gradients and the gas solubilities. Well, gas solubilities, how well will that gas dissolve? Carbon dioxide dissolves better in liquid than oxygen. And then if you have more oxygen, though, than carbon dioxide, so if you increase the amount of gas within a composition, that gas will dissolve more in liquid, and some gases dissolve better in liquids than others. The thickness of the surface area of the respiratory membrane, well, you have all these tiny, tiny air sacs within your lungs, creates a tremendous amount of surface area, equivalent to about a tennis court. You're probably talking about 3,000 square feet, maybe 100 square meters of surface area within your lungs. If you increase that surface area, you'll get more, a better exchange. And this is why then we're worried about any disease which could interfere with the surface area, which decreases surface area, or any disease which increases the thickness of that exchange membrane. And then ventilation, perfusion, coupling basically means, are you getting enough blood and oxygen to the alveoli? Some alveoli get too much blood for the air. Some alveoli don't get enough blood for the air ratio. So that air ratio has to be ideal. And it's never ideal, except maybe in the midpoint of your lungs. So when we talk about external respiration, let's walk you through this one right here. So we see the inspired air. The partial pressure of oxygen is 160 millimeters of mercury. Carbon dioxide is 3 millimeters of mercury. Compare that to the alveoli. Well, the partial pressure of oxygen is 104 and carbon dioxide is 40. But we're still going to have oxygen going in, carbon dioxide going out. Well, the blood leaving the lungs and entering into the tissue has a partial pressure of oxygen of 100, which is about the same as the alveoli, and of carbon dioxide 40, about the same as the alveoli. The tissues, the pressure of oxygen is less than 40. So if you have the blood with a partial pressure of oxygen of 100 and the tissues a partial pressure of 40, there's a difference of 60, the oxygen will want to go from the blood into the tissues. The tissues has a pressure of oxygen of 45, the blood of 40, carbon dioxide will want to go from the tissue into the blood. And then as we go, the blood going into the lungs has a pressure of oxygen of 40. So the oxygen from the alveoli will want to go onto the blood. And this is basically that we can see this chart here recognizes that the blood cells will be exposed to an alveoli for about 3/4 of a second, but they only need 1/4 of a second to carry the full amount of oxygen that they can carry. So a couple of notes. The respiratory membranes are about 0.5 to 1 micrometers thick. It's very, very thin. And the large surface area of the alveoli is 40 times the surface area of your skin. So think of how much skin you have in your body. Well, the surface area of the alveoli is that times 40. So we talked about this in terms of perfusion and ventilation. Perfusion is the blood reaching the alveoli. And ventilation is the amount of gas reaching the alveoli. So one of the issues that we see is that we can see there's a mismatch in ventilation and perfusion. So if we have ventilation less than perfusion, right, then what this means is we have less air going to the alveoli than the amount of blood. We might get basically where the capillaries feeding this constrict, and we decrease the amount of blood so that we see a better match for perfusion and ventilation. If we have ventilation is greater than the perfusion, so more air than blood, the arteries or capillaries can dilate and open up, and then we get a better match of ventilation and perfusion. And it's really a lot more complicated than that, but that's putting it very simplistically. So the transpiration of respiratory gases by the blood. Okay, so you have hemoglobin plus the oxygen, which will combine with oxygen and form a hydrogen ion. And so when you have the hemoglobin plus the oxygen, it goes to the lungs to pick up the oxygen and go to the, it turns into this simplistic equation. And when it gets to the tissues, it releases the oxygen to the tissues. So in terms of oxygen transport, it's carried in the blood in two ways. First off, 1.5% is dissolved in the blood plasma, and then 98.5% is loosely bound to the iron, Fe is iron, and the hemoglobin in red blood cells. And that's the way that is carried. So basically each hemoglobin molecule is composed of 4 polypeptide chains, and then each has iron containing heme group, and each hemoglobin can transport 4 oxygen molecules. And this is important to know. So if you have these red blood cells, they will have these iron containing heme groups. Like each hemoglobin molecule contains 4 polypeptide chains, and each polypeptide chain has an iron containing heme groups, and each hemoglobin can take 4 oxygen molecules. So if we decrease the number of red blood cells, you can carry less oxygen, you're not as aerobically fit. Let me put it this way. Biological females will have a menstrual cycle where they will experience on average every 28 days blood loss. Some females have a heavier menstrual cycle than other females. If a female has a heavier menstrual cycle, their aerobic capacity, the ability to deliver oxygen to active tissue at maximum, can be decreased as much as 10%. And to give you an idea, like I've given this tip to people that I assess for occupational purposes, and I've sometimes said to repeat customers, okay, pay attention to when your menstrual cycle is, because you might actually have a lower aerobic capacity at certain points in your menstrual cycle. And the feedback I've received anecdotally is, yes, I do. So oxyhemoglobin is basically, which is here on the right-hand side, is basically hemoglobin combined with oxygen. And then reduced hemoglobin, this HHB, is basically hemoglobin that's released the oxygen. And that's helped the loading onto hemoglobin of oxygen and the unloading of oxygen from hemoglobin. That's helped by a change in the shape of the hemoglobin. So as an oxygen binds to it, the hemoglobin actually changes shape and increases its affinity for oxygen. As oxygen is released, the hemoglobin changes shape and causes a decrease in affinity for oxygen. So when we say that your blood levels are fully, or hemoglobin is fully saturated, it means all 4 heme groups are carrying oxygen. Partially saturated, while 1, 2, or 3 of the heme groups are carrying oxygen. And how fast that loads and unloads can be determined by various factors. So this is a chart which you need to be familiar with. And really, this is oxygen transport, but this is the oxygen dissociation curve. And so how do we read this? Well, on the right-hand side, we see that we have 100% saturation at the top and 0% saturation at the bottom. So what does that mean? Well, at 0, the blood is carrying no oxygen. At 100, the blood is carrying as much oxygen as it possibly can. On the x-axis at the bottom, we have the pressure of oxygen. So we have 0 millimeters of mercury of pressure of oxygen, and we have 100 millimeters of mercury pressure of oxygen. So the thing to note is that this is not a straight line. It's not a straight line. You notice that it's a curve. And the significance of this is that if your oxygen, partial pressure of oxygen drops to the point where it's at 80 millimeters of mercury, your oxygen saturation has in fact probably dropped to about 96% saturated when you're talking about 80% millimeters of mercury. So even though your percentage of your pressure, partial pressure of oxygen has dropped by 20%, your saturation has only dropped 4%. And this goes all the way until we get to about 40 millimeters of mercury. It seems that at 40 millimeters of mercury, that's when we start to see a sharper decline in the saturation. So you can literally go, you can have your partial pressure of oxygen you can have a partial pressure of oxygen go from 100 all the way down to 60, a 40% decrease, and your saturation will only drop about 10%. 40% decrease in pressure, 10% drop in saturation. And this is a good thing. So imagine if you're climbing Mount Fuji or a tall mountain. So Mount Fuji in Japan, Mount Kilimanjaro in Africa, Mount Washington in the States, that as you're going up that elevation, the partial pressure of oxygen will go down because you're going higher in elevation, but the saturation will not go down as much. It's not until you get somewhere such as Mount Everest, where the partial pressure of oxygen at Mount Everest is about 40 millimeters of mercury, that's when you need to worry, because you actually do go below 75% saturation, and that's the problem that you may have. You may not survive that. Well, not for long. That's why they call it the death zone. I don't know if you're aware of this. If you climb Mount Everest, once you get near the peak, you're in what they call the death zone, that the pressure of oxygen is so low that you can't get enough oxygen into the system. And because of that, fluid actually starts to come out, and you can actually drown, even though we're on top of a mountain, because you get what we call pulmonary edema. Plasma is leaking into your capillaries, and that's why you can only spend about 2 hours at the top of Mount Everest um, without supplemental oxygen. So there are other factors that will act on oxygen saturation. And so I just go back to this for a second. If I were to show you this chart without any labeling, you need to be able to explain it. Okay, I want to repeat that. If I were to show you this chart without any of the labels, just this chart, you need to be able to explain it in a manner that demonstrates that you understand it. There are going to be other factors which affect oxygen transport. So normal body temperature is 38 degrees Celsius. If we increase body temperature, so you're running a fever, well, we'll find that oxygen saturation drops off quicker. If we decrease body temperature, say down to 10 degrees Celsius, then oxygen will remain in the blood. It will remain saturated. Other factors also include arterial carbon dioxide. So if we increase carbon dioxide, pH drops, you become more acidic, then the hemoglobin has less of an affinity for oxygen. If we decrease carbon dioxide, pH goes up, you become more alkaline, then we'll find that hemoglobin has more of an affinity for oxygen. So oxygen transportation actually is very simple then when you compare it to carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide will combine with water to form carbonic acid, which will then dissociate into a hydrogen ion and bicarbonic acid. And CO2, or carbon dioxide, is transported in the blood in 3 forms. First off, 7 to 10% is dissolved in plasma as partial pressure of oxygen. Second, 20% of carbon dioxide is bound to globin part of hemoglobin. And third, 70% is transported as bicarbonate ions. Right, you can see bicarbonate ions, HCO3 with a negative in plasma. So, and this occurs primarily with the red blood cells, where you have this enzyme called carbonic anhydrase. It will catalyze a reaction. So after bicarbonate is created, it quickly diffuses from the red blood cells into the plasma. This bicarbonate going out of the red blood cells is balanced by chloride ions moving into the red blood cells. So basically, as this bicarbonate forms, it goes into the plasma, but from the plasma, chloride shifts into the red blood cells to help with the charge shift. So we start to see this very complicated process. So we have carbon dioxide formed in the tissues, goes to the interstitial fluid, becomes carbon dioxide. You get some carbon dioxide dissolved in plasma. Then you get carbon dioxide combines with water to become carbonic acid, which becomes bicarbonate. The hydrogen ions will bind to plasmas in the protein. And you also get carbon dioxide that goes into the red blood cells, becomes carbonic acid, comes out of the red blood cells, but chloride goes in. And these hydrogen ions will also combine with hemoglobin in order to balance out. When you get to the lungs, you get oxygen going in, binds with the hemoglobin, dissociates this hydrogen ion. This hydrogen ion combines with carbonic acid or bicarbonate, which becomes carbonic acid, which associates in carbon dioxide and water, which goes into the alveoli. You breathe it out. Carbon dioxide dissolved in plasma goes into the alveoli, and this bicarbonate combines with hydrogen ion, which was with these plasma proteins, becomes carbonate acid, and then becomes carbon dioxide and water and goes into the alveoli. In terms of control of respiration, so we talked about the carrying of the gas. Well, you have this medullary respiratory center in your midbrain. So at the top, you're looking at a cross section of the brain. On the left-hand side is the anterior front. On the right-hand side is the posterior or the back. You can see the cerebellum and the cerebrum. And basically the midbrain, you have the pons and the medulla. So in this medullary respiratory center, it's basically these neurons, and you have ventral respiratory group and a dorsal respiratory group. So ventral is more towards the front, dorsal is more towards the back. Ventral respiratory group generates a rhythm, and it's like the integration. Okay, so these neurons in the brainstem extend from the spinal cord to pons medulla junction, and basically it sets up the normal respiratory rate and rhythm. Its inhibitory neurons excite inspiratory muscles via the phrenic and intercostal nerves, and the expiratory neurons inhibit the inspiratory neurons, right? So when you expire, those neurons inhibit the inspiratory neurons. When you inspire, when you breathe in, those neurons inhibit the expiratory neurons. The dorsal respiratory group is a group of neurons. It's basically at the root of one of the cranial nerves. And basically it takes input from different receptors and then sends it to the ventral respiratory group. So the dorsal respiratory group is kind of your monitoring system, and it sends information to the ventral respiratory group. And then the pons, or the pontine respiratory centers, basically influence and modify also activity of the ventral respiratory group. So ventral respiratory group controls the rhythm and the rate, and dorsal and the pontine respiratory centers give input to help adjust that rate. And just, something that's become more in the forefront within the last 5 years, especially with North America, is that we find that people are taking these opioid painkillers in terms of illicit street drugs. And one of them that has come of note is fentanyl, carfentanil. So these are very, very powerful tranquilizers. Well, these tranquilizers work by suppressing the ventral respiratory group. And if you suppress the ventral respiratory group enough, you stop breathing. And you stop breathing, you die. So what they do is they give naloxone kits. Naloxone basically intercepts the fentanyl and carfentanil and prevents it from binding to the ventral respiratory group. Here's the issue. You're at a party, you have a naloxone kit, somebody's doing illicit drugs, been mixed with fentanyl, they don't know it, they take it, they overdose, they stop breathing, you give them naloxone. Well, the naloxone combines with the fentanyl, so that person who had that high sensation from the drug is now, that high sensation is gone. But they're breathing. This is good. Now they're awake. This is good. Now they've run away. Why? Because they lost their high. So what we saw, or what we have seen in emergency services, is somebody overdoses on fentanyl or carfentanil. They get a naloxone kit. They wake up. They lose the high. They take off. They take another hit of drugs. However, naloxone only has effect for 20 to 30 minutes. So they get another hit of drugs, street drugs. They get the high back, but then the naloxone wears off, and those drugs from their previous hit, which were still in the system, also take place, and now they're double dead. So That's one of the things that when they send EMS with naloxone kits, sometimes they will send the police to help restrain the person, prevent them from running away and basically dying. Factors that influence breathing, well, the amount of carbon dioxide in your blood will affect your breathing, because if you have more carbon dioxide in your blood, you have more hydrogen ions in your blood becomes more acidic, the pH drops. So if we have an increase in the amount of carbon dioxide within your blood, which means increase in hydrogen ions, right? This will mean an increase in carbon dioxide and hydrogen ions in your brain's extracellular fluid. This will affect chemical receptors in the brainstem, which will then basically increase ventilation to get rid of the carbon dioxide and to get more oxygen in. Other factors, the receptors in the bronchioles will respond to irritants. So in those bronchioles, you have these receptors, which will then cause you, of course, to cough or sneeze to get rid of those irritants. And there's also an inflation reflex. The inflation reflex basically says you have stretch receptors in the airways. You can only breathe in so much. You can never on your own breathe in so much that you would make your lungs pop. It basically will stop you from inhaling and get you to exhale so that you don't increase the air pressure within your lungs too much. And of course, you're going to have other factors also. So if your muscles are moving, that will cause ventilation to increase. In terms of adjustments, there's adjustments for both intensity and duration that need to be made. So hyperapnea is an increase ventilation in response to metabolic needs. And ventilation can increase 10 to 20 times what it is at rest. And ventilation will increase really fast and then gradually plateau out until it reaches a steady state. And then when you stop exercising, ventilation will go down quick and then gradually steady out again. And there's three factors which may involve ventilation increase. First off, there's psychological factors. And we see this all the time. So for example, we explain to you a VO2 rest. This is where we measure the amount of oxygen your body consumes at rest. Well, we could do a VO2 max, which basically means in second semester in your labs, one of you is going to be asked to volunteer and you'll be you'll walk on the treadmill and then you'll jog on the treadmill, then you run on the treadmill. Every 1 to 2 minutes, the exercise intensity will get more and more intense. So it will increase. Well, with that kind of test, we actually see an increase in ventilation at the beginning, which then decreases, which doesn't make sense except the psychological factor, because the person is thinking, oh, I've got to do this maximal test. There's also simultaneous cortical motor activation of skeletal muscles, respiratory centers. So the muscles start moving and the respiratory centers will get activated to increase ventilation. And then third, excitatory impulses to respiratory centers from proprioceptors in muscles, tendons, and joints. And so it's not just, this is the actual receptors within the muscles will cause an increase of ventilation. Before it was the kind of central nervous. Number two is the central nervous stimulation. This is the peripheral nervous stimulation. And what we'll see is basically as exercise intensity increases, so will ventilation or breathing frequency and depth. So having said that, we are finished for this lecture.